Hello, my name is Peter Parfitt. Welcome to the New Brit Workshop. I've had my Festool TS55 for about 9 years now, and it's given me absolutely fantastic service. It was one of my first Festool purchases, and frankly I just couldn't work without it. Not so very long ago I dropped it, and I dropped it from quite a height, and I noticed afterwards that it was out of adjustment. Nothing else was wrong, it was just out of adjustment. So I corrected it and continued working. And then by pure chance, a few days later, someone asked me, "Oh, my TS55 is out of adjustment. How do I correct it?" So I thought, well, I better make a video about it. So here we go. Now there are 4 adjustments to make, but the first one is absolutely critical. You do this first. Now before doing any adjustments which involve the guide rail, it's important to tighten these 2 cam clamps. And basically what they do, they make the saw run snugly along the guide rail. And so you make sure there's no play between the saw and the guide rail by just tightening up these 2 screw adjusters. One there, and the other one you can just see, it's at the back here. Make sure those are nice and snug, and then that saw runs snugly along there. Now there are 3 key adjustments to make. First of all, making sure that the saw will cut at 90 degrees to the sole plate, and so it's doing the normal or most common sort of cut. And the next is to make sure that the 45-degree position is set correctly. So therefore that means then when you go through the angles they all should be correct, provided the 45-degree one is right. Now the first thing I want to do is to get the saw matched to the rail. Now if your guide rail is brand new and your saw is brand new, there's no need to do this step because the saw will be properly adjusted from the factory. But if you've had the saw for a while, as I've had this one, and because you've dropped it or whatever, something's happened, or maybe you've got a second saw that you need to match to existing guide rails, then what you need to do is to make sure that the blade, when it's matched to this guide rail, has its edge just touching that sacrificial strip. So what I've done is I've put my piece of stock underneath the guide rail, and I've made sure that the splinter guard, which has already been trimmed during previous saw operations, is flush with the piece of wood that I've got underneath here. So that's all nicely set up. So I'm now going to put the saw onto the guide rail, and I'm now going to plunge the saw, and with everything carefully set up I can see that there is a gap between the saw blade and the edge of the wood and the edge of that already cut splinter guard. So I need to adjust the saw so that the blade moves that way. Now there are 4 screws that hold the saw with the angle mechanism, both front and back, to the sole plate. And there are 2 at the front here, one there and one there, effectively either side of the angle adjustment here, and the same at the back, either side of the angle adjustment, one here and one here. And this is a 3mm hex driver, and that fits in nicely to those 3, the top 2 there and the bottom one nearest to the handle. But the one that's underneath here is a little awkward, so I've got a smaller gadget here, so I can get under there, plug that in, and I can undo that. So I've now loosened all 4 of those, and I'm going to put this carefully back on the guide rail. And now with those 4 screws loosened, I can now plunge the saw, and you can see it's moving to and fro. And so I'm going to push it against my stock and against that already trimmed splinter guard. So you would think that that's in the perfect position. However, there are a fantastic set of instructions which I really recommend to you. They're produced by Festool USA, and they're called the instructions for the TS55 saw. And there you'll find all of the adjustments which I'm explaining now, and they recommend that at this stage you put a piece of paper between the rear part of the blade and the wood that you're pushing against, and that way it gives a certain adjustment, a sort of toe in, which helps the saw to work across a long cut. So here I have a piece of paper, and I'm going to put that to the rear of the saw blade. So I'm pushing my saw up against the wood nice and tightly, and I'm going to tighten those 4 screws. And that now is running as it should along that guide rail. The next thing we need to do is to check that the saw is cutting vertically. First of all, make sure that the saw is in the 0 position as far as the mitre gauge goes, and that's in the rest 0 position, and tighten those 2 up. I'm now going to do a saw cut in this piece of stock. Now again, I've used the nomenclature which I found in the US Supplemental Manual, and I've marked this piece of wood showing which is the front and which is the top. So I've got my piece of stock pushed up against the little bench pups which are under here. I've got the guide rail snugly up against the 2 guide dogs, and the guide rails held against those guide dogs with the clips, and so I'm happy with that. I've made sure that my depth of cut is suitable for this 18mm MDF which I'm about to cut, and everything is locked up and ready to go. So we've done our cut, and I'm now going to flip one of these pieces over. And the idea is to see whether these 2 pieces are still flush and parallel. And the answer is, yes they are. Ah, typical. Let's pretend they're not. Now supposing there's a gap at the top as shown in the diagram on my right. Then what you do is you loosen the 2 clamps, one here and one on this side. So having loosened those, you'll see a screw here, and there's also a screw behind the handle just in here. If the gap is at the top, then what we need to do is to adjust these 2 screws clockwise. If the gap is at the bottom, then we adjust those 2 screws anti-clockwise. And after making the adjustment, you tighten the bevel locking front and back, and then do another test cut. And you then make further adjustments until you've got it spot on. And our final adjustment is to make sure the saw will cut precisely when it's in the 45-degree position. I put it there so that the bevel angle is shown as 45, and I've tightened up the 2 tightening knobs, one at the back and one at the front. Now, should we need to make adjustments, there is a small grub screw in here, and it's a 2mm grub screw just in there. We'll come to that in a minute should we need to make any adjustments. Now, it's really important when you're using the track saw in this sort of configuration that you remember that the centre of gravity of the saw now is beyond the guide rail. If I were to let go, it would want to fall down like so. So I have a technique to ensure that the saw will give a true cut, and that is to use my left hand to press down on the sole plate here as I'm doing the cut. And that ensures that the saw is constantly in contact with the guide rail, and therefore giving you the truest cut possible. Now remember, because we're cutting at 45 degrees, you need to allow your depth stop to go down a little bit further. Mine's set on 30mm, even though this is 18mm stock. That's a nice clean cut, a little bit of burn there, but nothing of any significance. It's because I was going a little bit too slowly. I'm now going make 4 cuts altogether, and my idea is that I will end up with 4 pieces which will be of a uniform length, and therefore I'll be able to check to see if it's cutting square. I've put this piece of wood here which has got a mitre cut on the end, and that's going to act as my end stop. So as I do each cut, I turn the piece of wood over, slide it along so that the mitred edge fits neatly against the stop. And so I'm now going to do 4 cuts to produce 4 pieces of hopefully identical wood. So there are my 4 cuts. I'm now going to see how true they are. And I think you may be able to see that my cuts are just a fraction over 45 degrees. So I need to make a small adjustment. So I've loosened the tightening clamps, one there and one at the other end. And because I'm greater than 45 degrees, I'm going to tighten this little grub screw here. Now, I must confess I don't know by how much to do it, so I'm going to do it just half a turn and then see what happens. And I'm going to put this back to the 45 degree position and then do another test cut. Well, this is quite an improvement. It probably needs just a tiny turn more and then that would be spot on. So I'm pretty happy with that as it is really, but I'll just do that little tweak of a turn and that'll be it. Well, I hope this little walkthrough of those 4 adjustments will help you. Just in case you're curious about my setup here, I've got the Festool guide rail and I've got these UJK rail clips fitted. And that then ensures the guide rail is firmly against these guide dogs which are in the bench top here, and I've got these guide pups which my stock is pressed against, and that ensures that all my cuts will be at a perfect 90 degrees. Thank you very much for watching. Take care. Bye bye. And for a bit of fun with these pieces, I'm going to show you that super technique which I've been taught, how to bring them together to make a perfect box, drawer, or whatever it might be. And I've shown this in a number of my videos. The key thing is to make sure they're all lined up against a straight edge. And then you apply tape, as I'm doing now. Keep them together. Once the tape is on, flip them over. Put some glue in, and then all we do is just bring it together like so. And the last bit needs a little bit of effort to squeeze everything together. And with that tape around there, that will now dry nicely, and you can see what a super little job that will be. So there's the makings of a square box. No clamps required, just some tape. And I've made a number of videos showing how to make drawers this way and various other things.